She was 7 years old when they sent her away. She remembered the day, clearly, the way her mother held her face in both hands, and looked at her for a long time without speaking. The way her father stood at the edge of the room with his back turned because he could not watch. The way the counselors in their formal robes spoke in quiet voices about honor and necessity and the future of humanity, while she stood in her best dress, holding a small bag that contained everything she was allowed to bring. 3 changes of clothes, a book of Earth stories her grandmother had given her, a photograph of her family taken the summer before, everyone squinting into the sun and laughing at something her uncle had said. That was it. That was what you were allowed to bring when you were 7 years old, and the council had decided to send you to the Keth Empire as a gesture of goodwill. They did not call it what it was. They used words like ambassador and cultural exchange and historic opportunity. Her parents used words like brave and proud, and we will see you again. She used no words at all. Her name was Lena Vasquez Spark. She was 7 years old. She was the daughter of a linguist and an engineer, which meant she had grown up in a house full of books and blueprints, and the particular kind of dinner table conversation that happened when 2 people who loved complicated systems loved each other. She had learned to read at 3. She had learned for human languages by 6. She had a memory that her teachers described as extraordinary, and her parents described as occasionally exhausting, and she herself described as just how her brain worked. She had been selected because of the memory, because of the languages, because of test scores that suggested she could learn the Keth language faster than any adult candidate and adapt to Keth culture more, completely because children's brains were still forming and adults were not. The council had been very thorough in their reasoning. They had been less thorough in explaining what it would feel like to be 7 years old and watch your home planet disappear through a porthole, while a Keth diplomatic vessel carried you toward the most feared empire in the known galaxy. She watched until she could not see it anymore. Then she opened her grandmother's book and began to read. The Keth Empire had existed for 600,000 years. This was not unusual among the older civilizations of the galaxy. Several had histories measured in hundreds of thousands of years. But what made the Keth different was not their age. It was what they had done with it. 600,000 years of unbroken expansion. 600,000 years of absorbing, conquering, or destroying every civilization they encountered. 600,000 years of a culture built entirely around the belief that strength was the only language the universe spoke, and that every interaction between civilizations was, at its core, a negotiation between predators about who would eat and who would be eaten. They were not evil. Lena would understand this later, much later. After years of living among them, and learning their history and sitting with their oldest scholars and reading their oldest texts, they were not evil any more than a storm was evil. They were simply the product of 600,000 years of a particular kind of survival. And survival had taught them a particular kind of lesson. And the lesson had become the culture. And the culture had become the empire. And the empire had become what it was. The most feared power in the galaxy. They had accepted the human child because accepting her cost them nothing, and refusing her would have required expending energy on a species too small to be worth the effort. Humanity had asked for a gesture of goodwill. The Kets had made the gesture the way an ocean makes a gesture to a stone someone tosses into it. Without noticing, without caring, without imagining, even for a moment, that the stone would change the water. Lena arrived at the Keth imperial court on a grey morning by their calendar, in the 43rd year of Emperor Vethkal's reign, in the 600,000th year of the Keth Empire. She was 7 years old, and she was very small, and she looked at the court enormous, ancient, carved from stone that had been old when humanity was still learning to make fire. And she felt something that she would spend the next 20 years turning into fuel. She felt completely, utterly alone. And she decided, in the specific way that 7-year-olds decide things, with total commitment and zero qualification, that she was going to be alright. Not because she was not scared, but because being scared and being alright were, she had learned from her mother, not mutually exclusive. The first year was the hardest. Not because anyone was cruel to her. The Keth were indifferent, rather than cruel, which was in some ways worse, because cruelty at least implied you were significant enough to bother with. She was assigned quarters in a minor section of the court, given a tutor for the Keth language, provided with food that was nutritionally adequate and culinarily baffling, and largely left alone. Largely, there was one exception. His name was Kale, not the same Kale from other stories. This one was different, smaller, younger, the third son of a minor imperial house, with no particular prospects, and a great deal of time on his hands. He was 9 years old when Lena arrived, and he found her, approximately 3 days after her arrival, sitting in a corridor outside her quarters, trying to read a Keth text that was several levels beyond her current ability in making, by his account, a face like she was trying to eat something that was fighting back. He sat down next to her, without being invited. "That text is for advanced scholars," he said. in Keth that her translator chip rendered slowly. You have been here 3 days. Why are you reading it? Because the basic texts are too easy, she said, in halting Keth that made him blink, and I learn faster when I am challenged. He stared at her. You have been here 3 days. Esai Dagan. Yes. You are speaking, Keth. Badly, she agreed, but I am speaking it. He stared at her for another long moment. Then he sat down next to her and pointed at a character in the text she had been struggling with. That one, he said, means something closer to inevitable than certain. The Keth concept has no direct translation into most languages. It refers specifically to the kind of certainty that comes from understanding how systems work rather than from wishing for an outcome. Lena looked at the character. Looked at Im, show me the others I am reading wrong, she said. Show with. Here. They sat in that corridor for 4 hours. It was the beginning of the only real friendship Lena would have for the next several years, and it was built entirely on the foundation of a child who refused to do things the easy way and another child who found that fascinating. Kale was, Lena would realize much later, exactly the kind of person who should not have been kind to her by the logic of Keth culture. He was the son of a noble house. She was a diplomatic token from a minor species. The appropriate Keth response to her existence was indifference. But Kale had grown up in the court and watched its workings with the specific clarity of someone who was not important enough to be managed, and therefore saw things that more important people were carefully not shown. He had seen what the Empire was. He had questions about whether it should be what it was. He had never had anyone to ask those questions to, until a 7-year-old human girl sat in a corridor fighting with a text that was too hard for her, and refused to read an easier one. By the end of the first year, Lena spoke Keth fluently. By the end of the second, she spoke 3 Keth dialects, and had begun studying the historical texts that contained the Kit language, a dead language, spoken only by scholars, which she learned because it unlocked the oldest records, and the oldest records told her things about the Keth that the current culture carefully did not discuss. Things about who they had been before 600,000 years of survival had made them who they were. Things that mattered. She was 10 years old, and already the most linguistically accomplished human in Keth space, which was not a high bar. There were only 3 other humans in Keth space, all adult diplomats who had arrived after her and who she was not supposed to have contact with but occasionally managed to anyway, through a series of increasingly creative communication methods that she never fully explained to anyone. She was also, by 10, beginning to understand the court. Not the surface of it. Anyone could learn the surface, the ceremonies, the ranks, the rules of address, and protocol and precedence. The surface was easy. She was beginning to understand the architecture underneath, who actually held power, and who only appeared to, which alliances were genuine, and which were performance, which members of the imperial houses were building something, and which were maintaining something, and which were trying to protect something they were afraid of losing. She had her mother's gift for systems. She had her father's gift for structure. She had a memory that forgot nothing, and a mind that connected things, in a childhood spent alone in the most powerful court in the galaxy, with nothing to do but watch and learn. She watched. She learned. At 12, she was invited for the first time, by one of the more curious members of a minor imperial house, to attend a formal court session. She attended. She said nothing. She remembered everything. At 14, she was invited again, and slowly, in the way that water works on stone, her presence in the background of court life became normal. Not significant. Not noticed. Exactly. Just there. The human child who had been here so long. She was furniture, the token that had been forgotten by the people who sent her and ignored by the people who received her. Furniture does not need to be careful around. Furniture can be talked in front of. Furniture hears everything. Kale turned 17 and was given his first real court position, a minor administrative role in the house records office that his family had arranged because it was the least embarrassing thing available. He took the role and used it to quietly give Lena access to historical records that were not publicly available. She read every one of them. She was 15 years old and she had been in the Keth Empire for 8 years, and she had not spoken to her family in 6 months because the communication windows were irregular and the court's monitoring of her transmissions had become more attentive as she became, paradoxically, more invisible to them in person. She wrote letters she did not send. She kept them in a file encrypted with a code based on her grandmother's book, the one she had brought from home, the one she still read sometimes at night. The Earth's stories that felt further and further away and closer to essential at the same time. She wrote, I am learning things. I do not know yet what I will do with them, but I am learning. She wrote, I think about you every day. I think the council did not know what they were doing when they sent me here. I think they thought they were making a gesture, and what they were actually doing was something else entirely. I do not know yet what, she wrote. I am not the person I was when I left. I am not sure if that is good or bad. I think it might be both. I think most important things are both. At 16, she saved a life. It was not a dramatic saving. It did not involve weapons or heroics or the kind of moment that gets remembered in histories. It was quieter than that. There was a scholar, old Keth, one of the court historians who had occasionally spoken to her about the pre-empire language. She had been studying who had made an error in a public document. A small error. A misattribution of a historical record that would have been meaningless in most contexts. In the current political climate of the court, with the specific alliance tensions that Lena had been watching develop for 2 years. In the specific document where it appeared, it was not meaningless. It would have been read as a deliberate insult to a powerful house. The scholar would have been called before the court. The consequences would have been severe. Lena found the error 3 days before the document was to be presented. She went to the scholar. She explained what she had found. She explained why it mattered. She explained it carefully, and without making him feel foolish, because she understood, from years of watching, that the Keth responded badly to being made to feel foolish, and what she needed him to do was fix the error quickly, not defend himself. Fixed italiano. The empire is built on a wound, she said. 600,000 years old. Never addressed. Never healed. Just built over. Layer after layer of strength and conquest and indifference. All of it sitting on top of one original moment of fear. She paused. The wound is still there. I have read enough of the old texts to know it is still there. The scholars know it is there. Some of the older houses know it is there. What does that mean? Gael, Asket. I am not wrong, she said. Not arrogantly, just with the particular certainty that 9 years of watching and learning and reading everything available had given her. I have been in this court for 10 years. I have read every text available to me. I understand this empire better than most people born in it. I am not wrong about the wound. Kale looked at her. What do you need? He said. She told him. It took 3 years. 3 years of careful, patient, systematic work. Of conversations that seemed unconnected. Of documents that seemed routine. Of relationships built over time with people who had been there long enough to remember things, and careful enough never to say them out loud. Lena was 20, and Kale was 23. And between them they had built something that had no name in Keth culture, because nothing like it had existed before. A coalition. Not of power. Not of military strength or economic leverage or political alliance. A coalition of people within the empire who had questions. Not rebels. Not revolutionaries. The Keth had seen both, and knew how to crush both. These were something harder to crush. Scholars and administrators and minor house members and aging generals who had fought enough wars to start wondering what they were for. People who had, in the private spaces of their own thinking, asked whether 600,000 years of one answer was really sufficient evidence that it was the only answer. People who had been waiting for someone to ask the question out loud. Lena, ask it out loud. When she finished, the Grand Court was silent. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound but the presence of something that everyone in the room is trying to process simultaneously. Emperor Vethkalo looked at her from his throne. It was old. He had been old when she arrived as a child, and he was older now, though the Keths aged slowly, and he had the eyes of someone who had ruled for a very long time, and thought he had seen everything. "You have lived in this empire for 13 years, he said. "Yes," she said. "You came as a child." "Yes." A diplomatic gesture from a small species. His voice was not contemptuous, just precise. "Yes," she said. "That is what they thought they were sending." A long pause. "And what were they actually sending?" he asked. Lena met his eyes. "Someone who would learn to love this empire enough to tell it the truth," she said. The silence stretched. Then Emperor Vethkal did something that the Grand Court had not seen in 600,000 years. He asked a question. Not a rhetorical question. Not the kind of question that powerful people ask when they already know the answer and are testing whether you do too. A real question. Open, uncertain. "What does the truth require of us?" he said. Lena answered him. She answered him for 3 more hours, with Kale beside her, providing records and citations, and the administrative precision that made everything she said not just compelling but verifiable. With the scholars she had spent 3 years cultivating, nodding at the historical references. With the coalition she had built, providing the steady background presence of people who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation in public. She did not tell the empire what to do. She was 20 years old and she was human, and she was wise enough to know that an empire does not take instructions. She gave them something harder to dismiss than instructions. She gave them a mirror. She showed them who they had been. She showed them who they had become. She showed them the space between those two things. The space she had always found most interesting. And she let them look at it themselves. What they did with what they saw was their choice. It took 5 years for the changes to become visible. 5 years of gradual, careful, contested, real change. Not revolution, not collapse, but the slow and difficult work of a civilization beginning to ask different questions about itself. Lena was there for all of it. She was there when the first diplomatic mission was sent, not to conquer but to negotiate. She was there when the historians published the pre-empire texts publicly for the first time in 300,000 years. She was there when Kale was appointed to lead the new Office of Historical Accountability, a position that had not existed before, and that he built from nothing into something that mattered. And she was there. 20 years after a 7-year-old girl had arrived on a gray morning with a bag containing 3 changes of clothes and a book of Earth stories, when the imperial court formally named her, not ambassador, not advisor, not token, empress consort, Kurula, equivoi in the governance of the Kith Empire. She stood in the Grand Court and received the title and thought about her mother's hands on her face and her father's back turned because he could not watch, and the photograph of her family, squinting into summer sun, and the small plant cutting that a general had grown from a piece of his dead wife's garden. She thought about her grandmother's book, still in her quarters, read so many times the spine had been repaired twice. She thought about the letter she had finally sent 6 months ago, when things had shifted enough to make it possible. The letter that said, "I am coming home. Not forever, but for a visit. I want you to meet Kale. I want to sit at the dinner table and talk about complicated systems. I want to stand in the sun and squint. I want you to know that I am all right. Not because nothing hard happened, but because hard things and all right are not mutually exclusive. You taught me that the court was waiting." Lena stood in it. Small, human, 27 years old, having spent 20 of those years turning an act of political convenience into something no one had predicted, and no one could have planned. She stood in it, and she looked at the people around her. Keth, ancient, complicated, carrying 600,000 years of survival in their bones and beginning, slowly, to put it down. She looked at Kale, beside her. She looked at the Emperor, older still, who had asked a real question 5 years ago, and had been genuinely listening to the answers ever since. She looked at the Grand Court, and the ancient stone, and the morning light coming, through windows that had been there since before humanity learned to write, and she thought, this is what you do with it. This is what you do with the memory that forgets nothing, and the mind that connects things, and the years of watching, and the years of alone, and the years of working, in spaces where no one expected anything from you. You learn everything. You find the wound. You name it with love rather than accusation, and you wait for the question, because the question always comes. Eventually, if you are patient enough, and honest enough, and brave enough to keep being present until it does, Are you ready to be something different? The Keth Empire had taken 600,000 years to ask it. Lena had been waiting 20. She had time. She had always had time. What she also had, what humans have always had, what no model accounts for, and no empire predicts, and no civilization that has never encountered it can quite prepare for, was the patience to stay. To stay when staying was hard. To stay when staying was lonely. To stay when everything logical said leave. Because leaving was safer and easier and more sensible than remaining in a place that did not know what to do with you. To stay and learn and wait and work and build the thing that needed building. One conversation at a time. One text at a time. One question at a time. One cup of patience at a time, offered freely, without guarantee of return. Because that is what you do when you believe that people, even people who have been frightened for 600,000 years, are worth staying for. That is, humanity. Not the strength, not the fighting, the staying. The patient, stubborn, relentless staying. We never leave. We never give up on people. Not even the ones who forgot, for 600,000 years, that they were people worth staying for. We remember for them, until they can remember for themselves.